Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'm going to talk about a little article that was written by one Boris Johnson back in 2013 about the pros and cons of leaving the EU. More than a little enlightening when compared to how both Boris Johnson and Brexit have turned out. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So back when leaving the EU was gathering pace as a concept in the Conservative Party, now that it had a leader weak enough to allow it to happen in David Cameron, the then Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, had a few things to say in an article in The Telegraph, where he wrote the odd column. And in this video, I want to talk about one particular piece. It wasn't exactly a pro-European piece. Quite the reverse, really, but it contained wisdom that we can see today, and many of you may be surprised to hear Boris Johnson be so clear on these points. But we do have to remember that Boris Johnson didn't become the public face of the Brexiteers, in the Conservative Party at least, because he was a believer, but because he saw an opportunity for political power. I liken him to someone who produces merchandise for flat earth events. You know, they don't necessarily believe in the concept, but you know what? There's money to be made, so their public views are malleable. This article, which was supposed to set out reasons for staying in the EU as well as for leaving it, you know, it's supposed to be one of those balance pieces, actually ended up calling out his 2021 self. It was quite spectacular towards the end of the article, if you were able to read it yourself, to see Boris Johnson writing about how everything about Boris Johnson in the here and now is what is wrong with the UK today. So Johnson made a number of points about our place in the EU, saying, you know, conceding that we were hardly at the centre of Europe because we're not involved in the euro. You know, his first point was to say, in terms of leaving the EU, there would be a risk that inward investment would be harmed, as investors would be put off the UK if we cut ourselves off from the, as he called it, giant European market. Well, this has now occurred. This has now come to pass. The second thing he said is that we would be putting UK firms at a long-term disadvantage if we no longer influence the setting of standards and regulations in Brussels. Now, this is an interesting point, because for those who are able to read this piece, I'll link it below, but Telegraph, it may be behind a paywall. You read it as if Johnson is a eurosceptic who nonetheless understands that we are better off in the EU, even if he doesn't like it. Which is what Boris Johnson really was. It's some Tory MPs regarded themselves as pragmatic remainers. Like a sulky teenager who doesn't like their parents' house rules, but they know that moving out to be truly independent appeals even less. So Johnson suggested that EU might even try and stitch things up against us. Now, he described this as being irrational. Now, here's the thing. It is absolutely the case now that we cannot influence EU regulations, but we still have to follow them if we want to trade, that it would actually make sense for the EU to go, well, let's put these regulations in because they don't do us any harm, but do you know what? It would screw up their industry. There's nothing irrational about stitching up a competitor. It happens in politics all the time. In fact, for a politician, because even at this time, Boris Johnson, although he was still writing, was a politician. For a politician to suggest that tripping up a rival when you get the chance is irrational is a rather, well, irrational thing to say. But any new regulations that actively work against UK manufacturing wouldn't necessarily even be stitching us up. As Johnson said, in the EU, we could influence those regulations and standards to the benefit of our manufacturers. Just the absence of that influence means that future standards will not be helpful to us. There doesn't need to be active malice, simply the absence of helpful influence is enough. And his third point, you know, brought home this last week or two, I would say, was that our global influence would be negatively impacted. Now, in this particular case, he's mostly talking about trade. He said that the EU is better placed to strike trade deals with the US or China than the UK on its own. Now, although we haven't seen exactly what a deal with the US or China would be, because we haven't got one, or are getting one anytime soon, we have seen lesser economies take us for a ride. Every agreement we have negotiated, and they've all been weak, has been way more in favour of the other side. We haven't had a single win in trade negotiations, and nor will we. Then his fourth point, he did 4 pros, 4 cons. His fourth point was that leaving the EU would risk us being seen as a narrow, xenophobic, backward-looking thing to do, he said. And you know, he also made 4 points in favour of leaving, you know, as I say, to be balanced. And because he was writing in a very backward-looking xenophobic paper and had to appeal to conservatives, so therefore he had to say, these are some reasons not to leave the EU. They're not tested. We don't know these will happen. Of course, they've all happened. But let's have a look at the reasons he thought for leaving. So the first one he said is we'd save money with not paying into the EU budget. Except, of course, we are continuing to cough up money for the EU without any influence over how it's spent. Directly as well as indirectly. Indirectly, because we've given the EU a competitive advantage over not only our businesses, but other businesses around the world, because we're not carrying checks out on them anymore. We're supposed to be starting some of them in October, but right now, the EU they have all the benefits of a free trade agreement with it without having to have a free trade agreement. And we're going to keep giving them money directly or indirectly, you know, when we inevitably return to wanting an agreement to reaccess the single market, it will be even more money. I mean, Norway, for example, is not an EU member, has access to the single market. It pays a pretty penny for it. You know, in terms of, it doesn't really matter whether you consider the fee they pay as a, you know, in proportion to their GDP or population. They pay more for that access than we did as members, proportionally speaking. In fact, Brexit has cost so much that the government are engaged in another round of Tory austerity cuts. And this isn't the pandemic. Don't think this is the pandemic. Those cuts were announced before COVID was a thing. They were deferred for last year because of COVID. So actually the pandemic had put them off for a year. The wheels are coming off Brexit sooner than some people expected, in fact. The potential for more layers of Brexit to be applied with inbound checks this October, more again in January, and a refusal on the part of the government to mitigate any of the harms means that Brexit is fast becoming unsustainable. There were sustainable forms of Brexit that were possible. This is not. Right now, all that's left of Brexit is ideology. That can sustain itself for a fair while for some, but it can't sustain its supporters forever. And it's not necessarily, I'm not going to say that some people will want to see some benefits at some point. I don't believe that. They never saw any benefits in voting Conservative, but they kept doing it anyway, out of fear that the alternative would somehow be worse. The same argument will still probably work. But when life gets so bad that people really stop believing that it would be worse under a different government, Brexit will dissolve very rapidly indeed. You know, we may not get a sudden sea change in public demands to rejoin with all haste, as some people would want, but there will absolutely be calls to re-enter the single market. After all, who can think of any problems that membership ever caused them? It's like, here's the harm that leaving has done you, which you can see. What was the harm it ever did you? What actually has improved in your life as a result of leaving? Nothing? No brainer. Then his second reason for leaving was sovereignty. Of course, sovereignty. With a particular focus on borders. Now, let's face facts. There are no problems with our borders that were blamed on EU membership that have gone away. In fact, if you listen to the same people who bang on about borders, according to them, it's even worse now. It's even worse that we've left the EU. So if leaving the EU didn't solve it, how would realigning with the EU possibly be a bad thing? Even for those who actually believe that we have problems at our borders with immigration. His third point was to say we could make our own laws again. I mean, we always did. That's what Parliament's for. But the idea that we would not have to accept EU regulations and legislation is already coming unstuck. We are doing. We've left the EU, we've left the customs union, we've left the single market, and we're still following their rules. Not because we have to legally, but because we need to economically. The only difference is that we don't have any say over those regulations anymore, which echoes the point he made in defence of remaining in the EU. We don't influence, we have to follow them, but we don't influence them. And then his fourth point, and this is the one that blew me away, it's brilliant. His fourth point was that we would not be able to blame Brussels. Now I'm going to quote this entire section because with hindsight, it's hilarious. Quote, "If we left the EU, we would end this sterile debate and we would have to recognise that most of our problems are not caused by Brussels, but by chronic British short-termism, inadequate management, sloth, low skills, a culture of easy gratification and underinvestment in both human and physical capital and infrastructure." I mean, what do you say to that? Bear in mind, this was his reason for leaving the EU, that this would be a good thing to expose. Short-termism, inadequate management, sloth, low skills, a culture of easy gratification, underinvestment in human and physical infrastructure. That's Boris Johnson's government, all right? But the key line there was that it would highlight that our problems are not caused by Brussels. He considered this a reason to leave the EU, remember? You know, as if the UK was being held back by people constantly blaming the EU for what was our own failings. So at least if we leave the EU, we can expose this. We can expose this culture. It falls back on us. We don't get to blame the EU anymore. We'll have to face up to the fact that we are just rubbish. This is one of the most astounding comparisons you can make of Boris Johnson before and after Brexit. This man who now makes a living out of blaming the EU, even though we have left, is the very thing that 2013 Boris Johnson said was wrong with this country. Basically, 2013 Boris Johnson has called out 2021 Boris Johnson in spectacular fashion. Now, normally I've only ever seen people called out by their earlier selves on Doctor Who. But there we are, might do this again at some point, because Boris Johnson said a lot of very interesting things when he was a pragmatic Remainer as compared to now. So yeah, what he said before Brexit was even a word as compared to now that it's in effect. It's entertaining if nothing else. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.